The studio lights blazed hot, but the host's words cut sharper than anyone expected. "Mr. Washington, let's be real," sneered Jake Rollins, leaning forward with a smirk. "You grew up dirt poor, scraping by. Doesn't that still haunt you every day?" The audience gasped, a collective breath stolen by the ruthless talk show host's audacity. Denzel Washington sat still, his dark suit crisp, his face a mask of calm resolve. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, just let the silence stretch, thick with unspoken power. Millions watched from home, hearts racing, sensing a storm was about to break loose. Jake chuckled, a hollow sound feeding off the tension he'd ignited in the room. "I mean, come on, Denzel," he pressed, voice dripping with mockery and disdain. "From a shack to Hollywood. Must feel like you're still faking it, right?" Crowd murmured, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning forward, eyes wide open. Denzel's fingers rested lightly on the armrest, his posture steady, almost regal. Then his lips parted, and a deep, resonant voice filled the studio air. "You ever tasted hunger, Jake?" he asked, and the room froze in an instant. Jake blinked, caught off guard, his smirk faltering for the briefest of moments. "Hunger?" he echoed, trying to laugh it off, but the sound came out weak. "Yeah, hunger," Denzel said, eyes locking onto Jake's with an unyielding intensity. "Not the kind you fix with a sandwich, the kind that carves you hollow." The audience sat silent, every word from Denzel landing like a hammer on stone. Jake shifted in his seat, gripping his cue cards, unprepared for this shift. Denzel leaned forward slightly, and the world knew something big was coming. "I grew up with that hunger," Denzel continued, his voice steady, rich, commanding. "Watched my mother stretch pennies, my father break his back for nothing." The camera zoomed in, catching the fire in his eyes, the weight of memory. "While you were playing games, I was learning what it means to survive." Jake tried to interrupt. "That's a nice story," but Denzel's gaze cut him off. "It's not a story," Denzel said, voice low. "It's the truth you'll never understand." A woman in the front row clutched her chest, tears glistening in her eyes. Jake forced a grin, desperate to reclaim control of his crumbling stage. "Survival's cute, Denzel, but this is Hollywood. Glamour, not grit, wins here." The host's words were sharp, but they sounded hollow against Denzel's quiet strength. Denzel tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Glamour fades, Jake," he said, each syllable deliberate, heavy with meaning. "But grit builds something real, something you can't fake on camera." The audience erupted in applause, some standing, but Jake's face turned red. "You think you're better than me?" Jake snapped, voice rising, losing composure. Denzel didn't answer right away, just let the question hang, heavy and unanswered. The studio buzzed with energy, every eye locked on the man in the chair. "I don't think anything," Denzel finally said, calm as a still lake. "I know where I've been and I know what it made me." Jake opened his mouth, but no words came. Denzel had stolen his thunder. What Denzel said next would echo far beyond that studio's walls. The studio air crackled as Denzel Washington's words hung like a challenge unspoken. Jake Rollins scoffed, tossing his cue cards aside, his smirk twisting into anger. "So you're proud of being poor?" he shot back, voice sharp with venom. The audience hushed, sensing the host had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Denzel's eyes narrowed, not with rage, but with a quiet, piercing clarity. "Proud?" he echoed, voice low and steady, cutting through Jake's bluster. "I'm proud of what it taught me, something you've never had to learn." Jake leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to mask his growing unease. "Enlighten us, then," he said, sarcasm dripping. "What's the big lesson, Denzel?" The crowd leaned forward, every ear straining to catch Denzel's next words. "It's simple," Denzel said, his tone calm but carrying the weight of years. "When you've got nothing, you learn who you are when the masks fall." A man in the back row nodded slowly, eyes glistening with unspoken recognition. Jake's laugh rang hollow, and the studio felt smaller, tighter, more intense. "You're dodging," Jake snapped, pointing a finger, desperate to regain the upper hand. "Poverty's not a virtue. It's a sob story people like you cling to. Denzel's faint smile returned, but this time it held a trace of pity. A sob story? He repeated, letting the words linger, heavy in the air. My mother cried when we had no food, but she never stopped fighting. The camera caught a woman wiping her eyes, her hands trembling slightly. That's not a story, Jake. That's strength you'll never know how to measure. Jake's face flushed, his composure cracking under Denzel's unrelenting calm. Strength? He sneered, voice rising. You're just playing the martyr card, the audience murmured, some shaking their heads, others whispering in awe. Denzel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on Jake's faltering gaze. Martyr, he said, voice deep and resonant, filling every corner of the room. I'm no martyr. I'm a man who turned dirt into a damn legacy. Applause broke out, sharp and sudden, but Denzel wasn't done speaking yet. Jake tried to cut in. Legacy? You're delusional. But the crowd drowned him. Denzel raised a hand, not to quiet them, but to signal he wasn't finished. You think legacy's about money, Jake? He asked, voice cutting through the noise. It's about what you build when the world bets you'll break instead. A young man in the front row clapped hard, tears streaking down his face. Jake gripped the armrest, knuckles white, his arrogance crumbling under pressure. Denzel's words were a mirror, and Jake didn't like what he saw. You're full of it, Jake spat, but his voice trembled, betraying his bravado. Denzel didn't flinch, just sat back, letting the host's desperation fill the silence. The studio pulsed with energy, every eye fixed on the unfolding reckoning. I've faced men like you before, Denzel said, calm but unyielding as steel. Men who think tearing others down makes them stand a little taller. Jake's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of doubt no one missed. What came next would turn this interview into a moment no one forgot. The studio lights dimmed slightly, but the heat of the moment burned brighter than ever. Jake Rollins glared at Denzel Washington, his bravado now a thin, fraying thread. You think you're untouchable? He hissed, voice sharp but unsteady with frustration. Denzel sat still, his presence a mountain against the host's crumbling sandcastle. Untouchable? Denzel replied, his tone smooth, deliberate, slicing through the tension. No, Jake, I'm just a man who knows what you're too afraid to face. The audience held their breath, sensing a reckoning was unfolding before them. Jake forced a laugh, but it cracked, echoing weakly in the silent studio. Afraid? He scoffed, leaning forward. I'm not the one hiding behind sob stories. Denzel's eyes sharpened, a glint of steel beneath his calm, unwavering exterior. Hiding? He said, voice low, each word a step closer to Jake's unraveling. I've stood in places you'd run from, places that made me who I am. A woman in the crowd clutched her purse, tears spilling as memories stirred. Jake's smirk twitched, but Denzel's gaze held him like a vice. You're all talk, Jake snapped, his hands slamming down on the desk. The audience flinched, but Denzel didn't move, just watched, calm and unshaken. All talk? Denzel asked, tilting his head, a quiet storm brewing inside. I've walked through fire, Jake, while you've been playing with matches. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some clapping, others staring in stunned awe. Jake's jaw tightened, his confidence slipping like sand through his fingers. Denzel's words weren't just a response, they were a mirror held up high. Jake scrambled, voice rising. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Denzel leaned back, folding his hands, letting the accusation hang in silence. Hero, he said finally, his voice deep, resonant, filling the room effortlessly. I'm no hero. I'm a survivor who learned to fight with more than words. A man in the back row stood, clapping slow and loud, eyes shining. Jake's face twisted, anger and fear battling for control of his expression. The studio pulsed with energy, and Denzel was only getting started. You're nothing special, Jake spat, but his voice cracked, betraying his panic. Denzel smiled faintly, not out of triumph, but a knowing, quiet strength. Special? He echoed, his tone gentle yet cutting deeper than any shout. I didn't need to be special. I just needed to keep going. The camera panned to a young woman, sobbing softly, nodding in recognition. Jake gripped his chair, knuckles white, his world shrinking under Denzel's weight. The audience felt it too. Something bigger than an interview was happening. Jake tried, one last jab, voice trembling. You're just a relic, Denzel, washed up. Denzel didn't flinch, just let the words bounce off him like rain on stone. Relic? He said, voice steady, eyes piercing through Jake's fragile bravado. Call it what you want, but I'm still here, and you're still running. The crowd roared, some leaping to their feet, applause shaking the walls. Jake froze, mouth open, a man exposed by his own hollow cruelty. What Denzel did next would leave the world talking for years. The studio trembled with applause, but Denzel Washington's calm cut through the noise. Jake Rollins sat frozen, his face a mask of fury and crumbling defiance. You're still here? He muttered, voice weak, clutching at his last shred of control. Denzel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the unraveling host. Still here, he said, voice deep and steady, reverberating with quiet power. I've outlasted worse than you, Jake. Men who thought they could bury me. A hush fell over the crowd, every soul hanging on his next move. Jake's hands shook, his smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of raw panic. You're bluffing, he stammered, but the words sounded desperate, almost pleading. Denzel didn't answer right away, just let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate. Bluffing, he finally said, his tone soft but sharp enough to slice steel. Don't need to bluff when I've lived what you'll never understand. The audience leaned in, some wiping tears, others gripping their seats tight. Jake's eyes darted, searching for an escape that wasn't there. You're a has-been, Jake shouted, voice breaking, a last gasp of bravado. Denzel's faint smile returned, not mocking, but rich with hard-earned wisdom. Has-been, he repeated, letting the word linger like a challenge unanswered. I've been called worse by better, and I'm still standing tall. A woman in the front row clapped, her hands trembling with emotion. Jake's shoulders slumped, his defiance draining under Denzel's unyielding gaze. The studio air thickened, and the world watched a man face his mirror. Jake tried to rally, pointing weakly, You're nothing without your sob story. Denzel tilted his head, eyes narrowing, his presence filling the room effortlessly. Nothing, he said, voice low, each syllable a stone dropped in still water. My story's not for pity. It's the fire that forged who I am. The crowd erupted again, applause mixing with gasps of awe and wonder. Jake's face paled, his hands dropping, defeated by words he couldn't counter. Denzel wasn't just winning. He was rewriting the rules of the game. You think this makes you a legend? Jake whispered, voice barely audible now. Denzel sat back, folding his hands, his calm a weapon sharper than any yell. Legend? He said, voice resonant, carrying the weight of a lifetime's trials. I don't need titles. I need truth, and that's what's breaking you now. A man in the audience stood, fists clenched, tears streaming down his cheeks. Jake stared, mouth open, a man stripped bare by his own cruelty. The silence that followed was louder than any shout ever could be. Jake slumped in his chair, defeated, his eyes hollow, his fight gone. Denzel watched him, not with triumph but with a quiet, piercing understanding. You asked about my roots, Denzel said, voice steady, filling the void. They're not a weakness. They're the strength you'll never know how to carry. The crowd rose, applause thundering, some sobbing openly, moved beyond words. Jake looked away, broken, but Denzel wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. What he said next would turn this moment into a legend of its own. The studio roared with applause, but Denzel Washington's voice rose above it all. Jake Rollins sat slumped, a shadow of the ruthless host he'd once been. You've had your say, Jake muttered, defeated, his eyes avoiding Denzel's gaze. Denzel leaned forward, his presence commanding, his calm unshaken by the chaos. My say, he said, voice deep and resonant, echoing through the hushed room. I'm not here to talk, Jake. I'm here to show you what matters. The audience stilled, every heart pounding, waiting for the final blow. Jake lifted his head, a flicker of defiance sparking in his hollow eyes. Show me? He croaked, voice weak, grasping at his last shred of pride. Denzel nodded once, his expression steady. A man forged by life's hardest lessons. You mocked my roots, he said, each word deliberate, heavy with truth. But those roots taught me something you'll spend your life running from. A woman in the crowd pressed her hands to her chest, tears falling freely. Jake swallowed hard, and the world leaned in to hear Denzel's wisdom. Running from what? Jake whispered, his voice trembling. His armor shattered. Denzel's eyes softened, not with pity, but with a fierce, unyielding compassion. Yourself, he said simply, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. You tear others down because you're too scared to look inside. The audience gasped, some nodding, others weeping as the truth sank in. Jake's hands shook, his face pale, a man stripped bare by Denzel's words. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with a shared awakening. Denzel sat back, folding his hands, letting his words settle over the room. I didn't come from nothing, he said, voice steady, rich with conviction. I came from struggle, and that struggle built something you can't break. The crowd erupted, applause thundering, some standing with fists raised high. Jake stared at the floor, tears glistening, his arrogance replaced by vulnerability. You asked if it haunts me, Denzel continued, his gaze piercing Jake's soul. It doesn't haunt me. It drives me, and that's why I'm still here. A single sob broke the silence, then another, rippling through the audience. Jake looked up, eyes red, voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. Denzel tilted his head, his expression softening, offering a glimpse of grace. You didn't know because you never asked. You just judged, he said. The camera zoomed in, catching Jake's trembling hands, Denzel's unwavering strength. The crowd cheered, some embracing, moved by a moment bigger than words. Denzel's truth had turned an attack into a lesson for the ages. Denzel rose from his chair, the studio shaking with applause and raw emotion. Jake stayed seated, head bowed, a man forever changed by what he'd heard. Life's not about where you start, Denzel said, voice ringing with finality. It's about what you do with it, and who you lift along the way. The audience stood as one, tears streaming, hands clapping until they ached. Denzel walked off stage, leaving a legacy etched in every heart watching. If this moved you, hit like and subscribe. Tell us what hit you hardest below.